It's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life in France. And we have Florence Villeneuve with us on the set, as always, to help us do that.
Hi,
Flo. You have a very tricky issue, a very tricky problem this week. It's France's relationship with its former African colonies. Now, this is a very delicate relationship that's actually come back into the spotlight once again in the wake of the post-electoral chaos we saw in Gabon.
That's right. France's relationship with Africa is long, complex, and often very murky. And in fact, there's a term that's used to describe what's seen as France's network of influence. It's called Françafrique, France and Africa welded into one term. Now, this is a complex, as I said, often controversial relationship that involves political and economic power, military cooperation, and a lot of money. And it must be said, Françafrique is actually quite a negative term.
Now, just to situate our viewers, France granted most of its African colonies independence in 1960, but it still retained considerable control.
That's right. Now, while officially talking about independence on the outside, France continued to pull a lot of strings on the ground because, remember, at the time, France had and continues to have today a lot of strategic interests in the region. Check out this map. This is just West Africa, and you can see all the resources there in the region. Françafrique was essentially put in place to secure access to these strategic raw materials. So you have oil, natural gas, uranium, but also diamonds and gold. Now, this has been very beneficial to French multinational companies. Of course, you have the nuclear giant Areva, you have the petrol giant Total, formerly known as ELF. But critics say that Françafrique for France was essentially France à fric. Fric is a slang word for cash, essentially. So Africa was essentially a source of cash for France. And on the flip side, for many African leaders, Françafrique was seen as a life insurance. Essentially, France has been accused of supporting undemocratic but loyal regimes to maintain its influence in its former African colonies.
Now, France also has a series of military agreements with its former colonies, and since the independence of African states about 55 years ago, France has intervened militarily something like 30 times.
That's right, a huge amount, and France has a significant military presence in Africa today. Let's take a look at a map. You can see France has military bases in Gabon, Senegal, and Djibouti, and you can see the French army is deployed in many of its former French colonies. Now, officially, these military operations have been to keep the peace, but a lot of critics say actually it's what's known as ingérence in France, essentially interference to safeguard French interests there. But others are a little bit more measured and see that it's more complex than that. Let's listen.
You can't dissociate a military intervention from strategic economic interest like energy, oil, and natural gas. But you can't explain a military intervention by that factor alone. It's not the determining factor, but one of many factors present in an operation.
Now, meanwhile, many African leaders have been accused of using money misappropriated from debt, aid, and other resources to actually fill their pockets.
That's right, and this actually leads us to our second word du jour. It's known as les biens mal acquis, essentially ill-gotten gains. French authorities are currently investigating the conspicuous fortunes of several serving African leaders or former African leaders and their families. For instance, you have the clans of Gabon's late leader, Omar Bongo. You have the Congo-Brazzaville leader, Denis Sassou Nguesso, and President Teodoro Obiang of Equatorial Guinea. Now, they're accused of having assets worth hundreds of millions of euros here in France, whether it's in flashy cars or real estate, etc. So that's one thing. But on top of that, some African leaders have actually been accused of trying to influence French politics as well using this development money. So you can see it's quite a complex net that involves several directions of a flow of money.
And yet, interestingly, today there is still this ongoing dispute as to whether or not Françafrique really still exists.
That's right. Now, when he became president, François Hollande promised, just like Nicolas Sarkozy before him, to put an end to Françafrique. Let's listen to him in 2012. So he had just been elected when he was speaking in Senegal.
The era of what we call Françafrique is over. You have France and Africa, and the partnership between us. A relationship founded on respect, transparency, and solidarity.
But not long into his presidency, some people started talking about a return of Françafrique. For instance, Hollande didn't reinstate the very controversial Africa cell at the Élysée Palace, but he did bring back the special advisor to the president on African issues. And on top of that, there were military interventions in Mali, the Central African Republic, and Chad. And then very symbolically, in 2013, troops from 13 African countries proudly marched down the Champs-Élysées for the traditional Bastille Day military parade.
So what about the future of Françafrique? Where's it going?
Well, Françafrique is essentially a utilitarian view of Africa, which means that France risks being out of step with Africa's youth, which is really thirsty for independence, democracy, and a healthier relationship with France. And it's really interesting to see different generations talk about this. Check out this grandson and his grandfather talking about the situation. This was in 2009, just after the death of Omar Bongo in Gabon.
We don't need France to intervene in our internal political affairs. We're mature enough.
We want France to participate in our development.
So you can see strikingly different hopes and desires there. Now, what's interesting is François Mitterrand, the former president, once said that without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century. So it's interesting to see how this controversial relationship, necessary relationship between France and Africa will pan out in the future with generations that are thirsty for more transparency.
Well, we're so happy that you'll be there to stay on top of it for us, Florence Villeminot, with this week's French Connections on that tricky relationship between France and Africa. Don't forget, if you have any other questions for Flo, be sure to write in to her tweet. Send her a tweet at Flo Villeminot.